You're listening to the Parents of Hardworking Teens podcast, episode 52. If your teen has ever gone blank in an exam or freezes up, has wished that they could memorize more information better or faster, or you see them revising, but you're not sure that they're doing it in the best way possible, then this episode is for you. I'm Katie Jones, and with over 15 years in education as an award-winning high school teacher, international external examiner, and as a study coach, I've helped thousands of students skyrocket their results and confidence. And this podcast is where I share all my insights, tactics, and tips with you, the parent, so you can help your hardworking teen get happy, smart, and successful in their study, and have you both enjoy the journey along the way. This is the Parents of Hardworking Teens podcast. Hello, very important parents and carers. I hope you're doing great and that your week is going really well. We are still in exam mode here on the podcast right now, with finals for those sitting GCSEs and A-levels and semester and trial exams happening down under or very soon to be. And this is the third episode in our exams trilogy on the podcast, but it can totally stand alone. So no need to have listened to 50 and 51 before this, but if you haven't caught those, then definitely go listen to them afterwards. Plus, a heads up for you if you are listening to this as this episode drops on Tuesday, the 30th of May. I love you, keen bees, and appreciate you. The live parent webinar all about exam technique and how your teen can excel in their exam prep and performance on the day in any exam is happening tonight. So that is 7:30 p.m. AEST, Tuesday, 30th of May. You can go get your seat for free at www.greattransformation.com/exams, because this is where I'm going to explain to you and show you visually all of the ins and outs of how exams really work, how they are written, are marked, all the things you are totally allowed to know, but most parents and students don't know they don't know. That unconscious incompetence that we talked about a few weeks ago in the 4 phases of mastery here on the podcast. And students just don't actually realize that they need or realize that they are missing. They're like blind spots that we just don't see for ourselves. And this is a big part of what I'm going to focus on in the webinar. The 3 exam performance killers. Dramatic, I know. But these are the things that are subtly sabotaging your teen's results without them realizing. So I'm going to explain exactly what they are, how they actually show up, so you can quickly tell if any of them are at play or happening for your teen. And of course, I'll share with you how to overcome them so that your teen not only maximizes their results, but also walks into any exam with confidence and no longer has to deal with, after the exam, yes, the disappointment when maybe they think it's all gone well, but actually their result isn't what they either wanted or expected. That's where those blind spots are happening, those 3 exam performance killers. But also not having to deal with the confusion and doubt that comes along with those, the dinks to their confidence, their doubts about their capability, or how to tackle things going forwards. So go to www.greattransformation.com/exams. I'll put a link with this in the show notes to save your seat for free, and I will be recording that webinar. So if you are listening to this after the 30th of May, the replay will be available for a limited time, just for 6 days, at that same web address. So head there, and if you're quick, you might still be able to get in on that. And so to today's exam focus, exam revision, because I do focus a lot on the application element of the study success formula, the knowledge plus application equals success formula. Because in my experience, that is the part that is most often the weakest link in the chain for students, especially hardworking students. And if you're only as strong as your weakest link, as they say, then we need to get that part fixed. However, the knowledge part is still important. It is half of that equation. And when it comes to exams, having great subject knowledge to walk into the exam with requires revision of the subject content and revising it in a way that means that the information goes in and stays in and flows easily from brain to paper in the exam hall. And I've spoken to so many parents who tell me that their teen either freezes or goes blank in an exam, or runs out of time to cover everything they want to or need to in their revision in the lead up to the exam, because they are not being lazy, but they're revising in ways that just aren't very efficient, or are also perhaps, in fact, I would go so far as to say likely, not actually very effective. So your teen feels like they're doing lots of work, they feel productive, they are studying hard, but it's probably not doing as much as they think it is. Or at least the outcome is not matching their hours and effort that they have been putting in. So let's break down what is going on in those situations and how to make everything much more efficient and more rewarding in terms of what they get done, how much they get through, and how much is taken into the exam hall and is actually turned into marks on the exam paper. Now, by far, the biggest mistake I see students making when it comes to revision is revising passively rather than actively. And that is exactly what I'm going to dig into on this episode. Because what that means is that they are doing stuff, they are doing revision type actions, but they aren't actually having to process. They're not doing anything necessarily with that information, when they actually need to be processing and converting the information, converting it from one format into another. So here's how you know, how you can tell if your teen is revising in a way that is active or passive. A great question to ask here is, could what they are producing be done by someone who doesn't actually know or understand the content? In fact, let's go back a step as a starting point. Even before we get into that, is actually anything being produced? If they are just reading over notes or just highlighting notes or watching a tutorial video, then they aren't actually producing anything at all. So that is definitely an alarm bell for their revision being passive. Because anyone could read through pages from a textbook or read through notes taken in class and not understand them or retain them. Anyone could watch a video and not actually understand or take in what was in it. So first of all, your teen needs to be producing something from what they are reviewing or revising. And secondly, it needs to ideally be in a different format, something that proves that they have processed and that they've understood the actual content. So there is nothing wrong with using a tutorial video or a textbook or their notes from class for their revision, but it's what they're doing with them that actually matters. So if they're watching a video, are they making their own summary notes from that video? Or are they drawing out a mind map of the content from it, or sketching and annotating a diagram? If they're using notes, could they turn that information into a diagram or a flowchart or a timeline? Or even could they produce their own 2-minute video summing up all of the important content from those notes? Now, let me be clear. I am not talking about them making their own, YouTube style or TikTok style tutorial videos here, because that would likely be more time consuming than other just as effective options. And they will likely start focusing on all of the things other than the actual content that would be involved in producing a video. But they could perhaps challenge themselves to give you or someone else a 2-minute presentation of the topic or the case study or the process that they have just reviewed. So if they only had 2 minutes to explain that content there and then, for example, in a super low-tech video, how would they put it across? Could they explain it verbally or visually, even on a whiteboard maybe? That would work. That would be turning written or printed textual information into verbal or visual. So it's important that they are converting information, that they're revising, because that is one of the best ways to ensure their brain is having to actually process it. Because we've all had that thing, right? Where we've read a page. I know I've definitely done this. I read a page and then realize I haven't taken any of it in. I'm like, I have no idea what I've just read. And that is, of course, not what we want to happen with your teen's revision. It's not what we want anytime, but it's definitely not what we want with revision. Because there are two elements really to revision. There's memorizing the information and understanding the information, making sure that we can actually recall it independently in the exam. Because we might understand something when we learn it, but then we find we can't necessarily remember it. Or we could memorize something by rote, by repetition, but it doesn't mean that we necessarily understand it. So by having to convert the information from one format to another, by having to explain something in a different way, we have to understand it. And I always remember an educator that was leading a PD, a professional development day that I was on once, years ago, but it stuck with me. They said, can they explain it in crayons? So if your students can't break down or simplify a complex topic, they just don't understand it well enough. If they can't explain each step or demonstrate a process or justify a quote, then they just don't understand it or know it well enough. Can they explain it in crayons? That has always stuck with me. And of course, this does need to ideally be happening at the point of learning the information. We really don't want your teen trying to understand or get to grips with this sort of thing, the understanding part, at the point of revision. That should ideally have already happened, but making that a part of revision is important. Because memorizing is what we consider revision to be about, but memorizing is not just factual information when it comes to performing well in exams. We covered that in episode 50, all about exam technique. It's also about reviewing and memorizing the understanding of that information. And memorizing something is not just as straightforward as going back over it repeatedly. We tend to think that's what revision is, repeating, going back over things. But we need to not only have that information stored in our brains, we have to be able to retrieve it and have it flow back out. We have to put it back down on paper, which is where we have to overcome the issue, the problem, the hurdle of what I call the familiarity delusion. And that is mistaking familiarity with the content for fully memorizing, being able to reproduce that content. The familiarity delusion is usually the reason why students feel like they go blank or freeze in an exam. It's not that they are going blank, it's just that they think they know the content, they thought they knew the content, when actually they are simply familiar with it. This is why rewriting notes or copying out diagrams or copying out whatever it is over and over in the hope that repetition will somehow burn it into their memory is not an effective way to revise for exams. It only works for super short-term memory, a matter of seconds, maybe a couple of minutes max. Because just copying something or reciting something or going back over something does not actually require any higher level of cognition. It's too easy. It doesn't require anything from our brains. We need to do something that requires more cognition and processing. And there are degrees of this. So we could go from just copying to trying to condense or summarize by just cutting out a few words. And a few ands or thus is not really going to do very much, even though technically we have condensed and summarized a little bit. But fully condensing, rewording, and adapting information is going to do a lot more. So it's really important that your teen truly considers what they are doing, what they're producing when they are creating revision resources or doing that revision. They might be doing something that feels really productive and looks impressive, but it might not actually be very effective. An example of this that I see all of the time is pages and pages of revision notes or stacks and stacks of revision cards. And I see some students making piles and piles of beautiful revision cards, and they carry them around feeling like, here is all my knowledge. Look at all the knowledge I have, which, side note, can actually lead to a false sense of security. And that is one of the problems in itself, because those cards might look like they have condensed information or that they've color-coded it, but what they've actually done is just transfer or move information from bigger pages, maybe that's from a textbook or from their original class notes, onto smaller cards. The cards are smaller, so they look condensed, but the information is pretty much the same. And they have maybe used color, but the color selection doesn't actually mean anything. They haven't truly converted or processed anything, really. And if your teen's doing things like this, then they probably do feel like they are working hard. And indeed, they are. They're putting in the hours and ink. But they aren't actually working hard in the true sense, because their brain is not actually having to do much work in order to produce that outcome in terms of their cognition. We have to do something for the information to actually go in and be able to retrieve it. So I thought I'd just share with you some super specific, practical, proven ways to turn passive revision into more active revision. So let's start off with those revision cards, because I know they are such a popular way for students to do this. So have them get a full page of information, maybe a written page of class notes, maybe it's a full page from a textbook, onto one card. This is going to ensure that they're truly processing and distilling information. And I'm not talking about one card as in they get to complete both sides of the card and they're writing in, size 6 handwriting font, but one side of one card. And yes, they're probably going to say that they need more space than one side of the card. But here's the key. Revision is not about getting down information, recording information. It's not even about learning that information. Those things should have already happened. So now it's about reviewing that information and having to make careful judgments about what makes it on the card and what doesn't is part of that activity, the active revision of making the brain do something with that information. It's about making links, making decisions. And those are what are going to mean that that content is committed to their long-term memory of days or weeks, rather than short-term in seconds or maybe a couple of minutes. And on those cards, have them use a system for color coding the information. So it might be things like red for keywords and terminology and definitions, blue for processes, green for examples or case studies. And the purpose of this is not to produce pretty cards. It's about retaining that information in a way that it can be easily recalled. So color coding is great because it gives the brain more visual cues, but they need to make those colors mean something. Plus, their brain just having to make the decision of which color they should be picking up for this piece of information is them processing that information more carefully. And then they can actually use these cards, have them do something with them rather than have them in stacks in a box. So they could lay them out on the floor into some form of like visual mind map, collecting different cards together and putting those on one side, or a flow chart where they make links and connections between them. So they're actually using some kinesthetic and visual learning here. Maybe they might even then draw that out onto an A3 page from memory, perhaps. We just don't want them copying out, remember? So it's not just like look at what's on the floor laid out and then put that on a piece of paper. That would just be another form of copying. But maybe they could order these cards from what they know the best to know the least, and then they can focus on testing themselves and working on those ones that are in the least end of the scale, or ordering them as a timeline of events or steps in a process, or even ranking them in an order from maybe most significant to least significant, according to maybe a particular situation or perspective or event in history. So again, it's not really about the actual order. it's about having them consider and think through the information to make those decisions. Because if they don't truly understand the concepts or events, then they're not going to know which one is most important or which one does go first or is more significant. And I always like to use examples with cards because, like I said, I know so many students are adamant that they really want to make revision cards, and sometimes trying to persuade them to do something completely different is just way too much of a stretch, especially if they're approaching, some really important or final exams, which I completely understand. So we just really want to encourage them to make them or use them in ways that are as effective as possible. Make them more active, because revision cards aren't bad in themselves. It's just that often they're being created or used in passive ways, where information is just written out without much processing or converting. And then they're just read through or used to test from. They just flip them over. And there are so many more opportunities for them to be used more actively. And then there are, of course, an infinite number of other options as well for active revision. And these might also suit your teen better if they aren't a big lover of making notes, or they know that they are much more of a visual learner, for example. Could they turn a written account into a timeline? Can they turn a diagram into an explanatory paragraph? So notice that having a long paragraph is not a problem. It's just a problem if it was a paragraph format to start with. But maybe it's a diagram and they could actually write out in words what is happening in that diagram. Or it could be a video tutorial that they then turn into a mind map summary. Can they turn a novel into a comic strip of significant events and quotes? And nothing artistic is needed here. Stick figures and symbols are the way to go. Because works of art are time consuming, and again, they're not focusing on what is important. And I will say it's often the students who are less artistic that are most resistant to these sorts of activities, but also get the most benefit from them because they're the ones that have to work a little bit harder. They are more challenged by them, which means their brain is having to do more and will therefore likely remember more of the information that they have been dealing with. Because remember, it's not about producing something amazing looking. We don't want a beautiful comic strip. It's about processing the information in order to produce it. And so just to go a bit deeper on this one for a second, another thing to consider is having them challenge themselves to have not an unlimited or unspecified number of, let's say, boxes for the comic strip. Just like we had them get all of that information onto one card, they could have, say, 10 boxes for that comic strip. And if they have exactly 10 boxes that they need to fill, they need to really carefully consider what would go in each of them if they have just gone through a 300-page novel. So maybe they think they only really need 9 to get all of the key points across. Well, we're going to take away the option of just putting the end in box 10, because I have definitely seen that a few times. They have to make themselves really think, what would be another event or relevant, significant issue or character moment or whatever it might be that would make the whole thing 10 boxes long and still be useful here or have some connection here? Or maybe they would ideally like to have 14 boxes to fit everything in that they want to, in which case they have to consider which things are less significant or could be left out, or could they combine 2 issues or concepts or events into one? Because anything that makes them think and consider and make decisions or connections is what we want here. And often these types of revision activities will, as a bonus, often also be quicker than those more traditional ones. Drawing a series of stick figures and speech bubbles or producing a timeline for key events in history, for example, should be faster than writing out all of the information as a page of notes. And a chunk of that time should be being spent on making the decisions about what's going on there and how and what format, and making those choices about what's important, what is less so. These are the things that are actually going to make this active and have their brain process the information. And finally, definitely doing past papers and practice questions does count as active revision, because they're having to take the original information and adapt it to what the question is asking. Plus, they're obviously getting instant feedback on whether they truly know the information or are just familiar with it. If they think they know a topic, but then they struggle to recall whatever information is required for an answer, then that is an instant alert to them that perhaps the familiarity delusion is at play here. So I hope that gives you and your teen some ideas and tips to have them revising actively and reduce or ideally eradicate any revision that might be more passive, so that their time and effort gives them maximum return on effort, because that information is going in and staying in and flows easily for them from brain to paper in that exam hall. So don't forget to come join me at the Exam Technique webinar for loads more practical tips and insider parent information on how exams really work. Your teen is absolutely welcome to come along with you. Go to www.greattransformation.com/exams to register or to catch the limited time replay if you are listening to this after the 30th of May. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. I hope that if your teen is sitting exams, that they are feeling confident and they're performing at the best of their ability. And I will meet you back here for another episode next week. Hey, if you're a repeat listener, I would be incredibly grateful if you take a moment to rate and review the podcast. I'm not big on asking for these things, but I'm on a mission to help as many students and their parents as possible, and having more ratings and reviews really does help with that. It takes less than a minute to do, and it will make me love you lots if you do.